This this is the educational fugitivity session.
I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong program.
That's okay.
I have to leave.
Dr. Pendergrass.
Bye.
Have a good session.
Okay, I'll try to figure out how to get into this thing.
All right. So, good morning. And I just want to say greetings and welcome to our collective presentation, New Visions for Educational Fugitivity. And I just want to thank the National Conference of Black Political Scientists at this 53rd anniversary meeting for having us here and allowing us this platform where we cultivate each other professionally. And thank you, NCOPES, for the slides. So on that note, Margaret, there you go. All right, so, okay, here we go. All right. So first of all, I would like to just honor our honorable ancestors and acknowledge them here in this space, invite them to join us. And I am Dr. Françoise B. Cromer, Professor of History, Culture, and Politics at St. Elizabeth University in New Jersey. And I am also Secretary of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. I'm honored to be working with these brilliant emerging scholars as they research, write, and present on real-life issues like alternative education and real-life issues with immediate implications. It is my honor to introduce the New Visions Collective in the order in which they are presenting today. So first we have Margaret Goldman. She is a fourth-year doctoral candidate in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society, and all but dissertation, ABD, at the University of California in Irvine. Margaret Goldman's paper responds to the Visions of Black Futures at a Crossroads theme by capturing an active experiment in alternative forms of social organization that might serve as a blueprint for abolitionist possibilities at multiple scales, within, against, and outside of conventional educational institutions. Grounded in students' insights, her project questions the limitations of educational reform and the possibilities for fugitive departure from carceral schooling and the other sites of anti-Black enclosure. Second is Evelynn Cuautle. She is a 2021 University of California, Irvine graduate with a Bachelor of Arts in Public Health Policy. She is currently a research assistant to independent researcher and filmmaker Angela LeBlanc Ernest for the Oakland Community School Project, OCS. The Oakland Community School Project is a digital humanities project commemorating the history and legacy of the Black Panther Party's award-winning educational institution and survival program. Her involvement in the project as a research assistant centers archives and the narratives of children and participants of the OCS throughout its 11 years of operation. Third, we have Tiffani J. Smith, a doctoral candidate finishing her degree in the School of Educational Studies with a certificate in Applied Gender Studies at Claremont University. Her research focuses on Black girlhood studies, educational studies, hip-hop, policy, and media studies. Fourth, we have Tara Jones, who serves as coordinator of the African Diasporic Cultural Resource Center at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And she is in the final stages of her doctoral candidacy as well, in-depth psychology, specializing in community liberation, indigenous, and eco-psychologies at Pacifica Graduate Institute. She researches teacher well-being, educational fugitivity, revolutionary Black mothering, and Legacies of Transnational African Diasporic Research. Fifth, we have Mariel. Rowland, who is a first-year doctoral student at in the Culture and Theory Department at the University of California, Irvine. Her research centers radical Black women educators, the people who made space in the education system where there seemingly was none. Tracing a network of rupture, she considers the ways in which Black feminist pedagogy moves over time and in between people. So at this time, I would ask everyone to please listen to our presenters with open ears and hearts, and we will begin. Margaret, thank you.
Thank you so much for the introductions, Dr. Cromer. So the title of my paper is Carceral Education and Conditional Care, a Call for Departure. When Jalissa was still a student at Freedom Arts Continuation High School, where she and I both now teach, she told me this. She said, I was always smart. I never had a problem completing the work. That wasn't the problem for me. I think it was the focus. That's why I like Freedom High so much, because it's people like me. It's people like me here, but not everyone is like me, you know? And especially the teachers, like they just know. They know life shows up for everybody. A single braid intent on freeing itself from the others cascaded over her shoulder, and she pushed it back without skipping a beat. Her face, her breath, her eyes unchanging. In a regular school, they don't really give a fuck, she continued. Like, say if your grandma died. They might care for a moment or say they care, but once it starts affecting your performance, they don't care. She shook her head slowly, eyes narrowed, pointed towards the floor, but looking past it, looking at something that already happened, something replaying in her head. Nah, once it starts affecting your performance, they don't care at all. We had been sitting in my classroom at Freedom Arts High, what I'll call free for short, still barren as I was making the transition from ethnographer to teacher ethnographer. Free is a continuation high school in South Central Los Angeles developed by Youth Rising Up, a grassroots abolitionist organization led by system-impacted young people in their communities. As part of a broader movement to end all forms of youth confinement, YRU developed Free in 2007 as an alternative to both traditional schools and youth lockup. Despite the institutional positioning of most continuation schools as zones of abandonment, Free is a police-free, suspension-free educational space grounded in principles of transformative justice and focused on grassroots movement building and political education. It serves and was created by young people who have been pushed out of, barred from, or otherwise refused to participate in traditional schooling. After being forced to relocate by the Los Angeles Metropolitan Transportation Association, which demolished their original Inglewood home to build a parking garage, YRU took over and is in the process of beautifying a juvenile detention center that they organized to shut down about 7 years ago. This is where Free now lives, where Jalissa and I sat in a room with windowless walls aching to be torn down, a monument and promise of spatial reclamation. My research has looked to this space and these young people's stories and insight as blueprints for abolitionist experiments in alternative forms of social organization. More specifically, working from Free's ideological positioning of itself as neither an institution of confinement nor an institution of traditional schooling, my research aims to think through Free and by extension other alternative schools for their potentialities as fugitive educational spaces that exceed even as they are absorbed into the carceral education state. As vital but often forgotten sites of meaning making, I am interested in what they might tell us about abolitionist responses to compulsory schooling and its symbiotic relationship with prisons and other sites of anti-Black enclosure. Stated another way, Free's origin story, the idea birthed between the words and breaths of a conversation on a South Central storefront, the vision carved out through restless fingers onto desks that should have been replaced years ago, or tagged by truant visionaries onto state property that belongs to no one, everyone. The exigency organic to a set of people in a particular place at a particular time, people who lack resources but not resourcefulness, people abandoned by the state, and the dynamic growing space into which that origin story has evolved, articulates to me the difference between pursuing change from within institutions, narratives, and choices that we have been offered, and departing from them fully. Not underground, but outer space, nestled in the cracks of the concrete, imminent to but transversing the carceral state. Free's blueprint, developed in departure from both prisons and schools, opens space to engage the possibilities of abolition and the limitations of educational reform. Thus, my overarching theoretical question has been, what are the possibilities for creating fugitive or liberatory educational spaces in the shadow of the traditional school system? And what are the implications for abolitionist alternatives to carceral schooling as a site of what scholar Damien Sojourner calls anti-Black enclosure? What I've aimed to do more specifically with respect to Free is to understand and capture the ideological, pedagogical, and interpersonal construction of this space. What makes this space different, what makes it fugitive, which is not to say without contradictions. This is an 18-month ethnographic study that draws from observational fieldwork, interviews with Free staff, and education oral histories with Free students, all of whom are Black, Latinx, and are Mexican or Chicanx, all of whom are system impacted or currently under the surveillance of the prison industrial complex, and all of whom navigate overlapping landscapes of dispossession that are largely space-based. Theoretically guiding this study is critical geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore's notion of forgotten places, which I've recapitulated in the current study as forgotten spaces. In Forgotten Places and the Seeds of Grassroots Planning, Gilmore conceptualizes prisons as a single, though spatially discontinuous, abandoned region. Critiquing her own concept of the gulag to capture the massive buildup of California's prison economy, she contends that it did not enable a description of what else is out there beyond its margins, and asks what kind of concept might get at the kinds of forgotten places that have been absorbed into the gulag yet exceed them. Thus, she conceptualizes forgotten places as those beyond the margins of the carceral state, where organized abandonment and the critical consciousness that accompanies it cultivate unique capacities for collective organizing. In my reading, forgottenness signifies not a pathologization of dispossessed and racialized spaces, where space is both body and place, but rather a spatial relationship and an act of flight, departure, or stealing away, which is, through an abolitionist and Black radical lens, an act and project of recreation. It can therefore be clarified that Exceed in this context captures a particular type of abolitionist transformation that is unique from reform, critique, or resistance. Finally, this act of departure and reclamation and the current future possibilities opened up by Free's vision can and must be read through the lens of transformative justice, articulated here as an epistemology, which refers, among other things, to a set of practices that happens outside of the state. Lastly, Gilmore's theorizations have led me to think of things spatially, which is always also to say racially. In analyzing the sometimes paradoxical role of alternative schools in processes and structures of dispossession and departure, I found it most useful to think of things in terms of a landscape, which allows me also to think about the movement of people, ideas, emotions, relationships, and resources across space, and to think through and about both oppression and radical transformation as simultaneously spatially continuous and necessarily particular to place. This idea is not something new, but a conversation I'm joining. Thinking about carcerality and therefore necessarily anti-Blackness spatially, in my case as an educational carceral landscape, allows us to ask vital questions about what it means, what it takes, and when it becomes necessary to exceed rather than resist that landscape. These questions are also invitations to break fertile ground and plant new soils in places they said life was never meant to grow. And so I want to return to Jalissa's statement as one that captures some key preliminary findings of my work. In particular, her summary of the difference between the free space and regular schools reflects something that has emerged over and over through field notes and interviews but especially through conversations with young people in the space. While the students express a sense of deep existential safety over having peace builders rather than cops and transformative justice rather than punishment, what I hear most often are things like, they get it, they understand, and especially they actually care. Its repetition demanded that I grapple with this seemingly mundane statement, they actually care, and its placement in the movement towards abolition. Heeding that demand, I conclude with a few propositions. Within the educational carceral landscape, there are, or so we're led to believe, good schools and urban schools and schools for the badass kids. Conditional care within this landscape is both necessary for and an outcome of the colonial, white supremacist, patriarchal, and ableist ideology that certain people are disposable. It is necessary for and an outcome of systems that disappear people as racialized proxies for social problems into forgotten spaces like prisons and alternative schools. Thus, as necessary for and an outcome of these ideologies and systems, this conditional care is fundamentally anti-Black, rooted in myths of meritocracy, and leeches off an epistemological meta-narrative that binds productivity and performance to who counts as human. My argument is that this conditional care is endemic to American schooling, and that this is not a matter of individual teachers who care or don't care, although that is certainly important, but rather of the institutional and ideological context they operate within. To grapple with this conditional care is to recognize that relationships structure and are inextricably structured by these contexts, which determine the forms of social organization that are possible. In a similar vein, I'm thinking through the repeated sentiment, they actually care, and what that means at a structural or spatial scale. That is, rather than an emotion or condition or action that occurs solely at the individual level. So I'll end with a set of questions intended as points of departure for further conversation. How does this seemingly unconditional care reflect Free's broader grounding ideologies and the social relationships that structure and are structured by the space? Likewise, what are the terms and conditions, the sets of laws and ideologies that preclude or punish this demonstration of unconditional care in institutions of traditional schooling, whether at all or once students stop performing? Thank you so much, and I'll pass it over to Evelynn.
Thank you so much, Margaret. So yes, my name is Evelynn, and today I will be presenting Education as Liberation, honoring the legacy of the Oakland Community School. As a part of the New Visions for Educational Fugitivity Collective, I introduced the legacy of the Black Panther Party's Oakland Community School, or OCS, and its radical educational model. The Oakland Community School was founded in 1972 and is the longest recorded community survival program in the history of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense's international resistance. My personal introduction to OCS took place in June and July of 2021 through my participation in the UC Irvine OCS Summer Research Fellowship Program. As an undergraduate research fellow, I had the opportunity to immerse myself in digital OCS archival material collected by independent scholar and OCS project director, Angela LeBlanc-Ernest. My main research tasks included transcribing oral histories of students, parents, and staff who had various roles at the school, along with organizing archival material. My ongoing involvement with the school's eponymous digital humanities project has inspired a personal reflection of my own formative educational experiences by honoring the liberatory pedagogies embodied at OCS. I believe a collective exploration of the school's history allows us to imagine and actualize fugitive educational learning spaces that actively divest from the interlocking systems of oppression addressed by Black feminist Combahee River Collective that render individuals and communities unwhole. Educational strategies modeled at OCS that I will discuss further refute narratives of unwhole communities and resist oppressive dynamics following radical lineages of abolitionist thinking within the sphere of education that require complete rebuilding of schools, not reforming them. In 1966, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense's co-founders, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, drafted the organization's 10-point program outlining the group's collective demands and beliefs moving forward. Oakland residents in the 1960s specifically experienced an economic depression with substandard living conditions and witnessed a housing crisis exacerbated by governmental initiatives, racial discrimination in the real estate and finance industries, underemployment due to rapid deindustrialization, widespread and lethal policing, and an educational system not representative of the Black experience. Point 5 of the party's platform highlights their shared position on the shortcomings of this educational system and reads, "We want an education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want an education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. We believe in an educational system that will give to our people a knowledge of self. If a man does not have knowledge of himself and his position in society and the world, then he has little chance to relate to anything else." This mission inspired party members to introduce innovative methods of learning to combat the public school system that was failing Black and poor communities in Oakland. OCS administration and staff intentionally centered these oppressed communities and led with an intergenerational approach against the backdrop of the decadent American society party members observed and were targeted by. The Panthers understood the need for a community school that could educate children without obscuring their history under the guise of patriotism. Ultimately, the party's extensive community education efforts animated their firm belief that knowledge of self and all efforts to educate oppressed communities are critical for liberation. The OCS curriculum restaged the pursuit of a better and different kind of society through novel forms of assessment and definitions of discipline that were quite revolutionary for their time. In line with the party's ideological philosophies regarding Black liberation, OCS staff empowered students to think critically and creatively beyond a deficit organizational structure that deems students of color substudents, reinforcing white supremacy. Scholars Allen and Liu discuss this structure as one that systematically creates problematic school expectations where inequitable, even abusive conditions manufacture racialized achievement patterns. Instead, OCS educators decentered standardized testing, problematic school expectations, and uniformity while orienting their educational model around the needs and interests of each child. The elementary level school did not have typical grades, but instead offered levels of learning not limited to students of a particular age range. Students were assessed through periodical evaluations later given to their parents and were taught following a flexible but complete curriculum, including mathematics, language, physical education, visual and performing arts, science, social sciences, Spanish, environmental studies, music, and drama. OCS carried small class sizes and wide-ranging opportunities for children to explore interests of theirs. Instructors understood that concentration is a natural consequence of voluntary interest, but without interest, there can be no concentration. Thus, understanding their roles as educational leaders who intentionally create opportunities to foster children's confidence and natural curiosity about each other, the conditions they experienced, and their society around them to be the basis of their development for concentration. Learning methods at OCS epitomize the notion that compassionately meeting students where they are academically does not necessitate a compromised level of academic rigor. Gregory B. Lewis, former OCS student and child of then rank and file Black Panther members, reflects on the school's extent of empowerment and boundary-pushing methods of academic discipline. He reflects, OCS became a real sanctuary away from the United States government. It gave me a real avenue to not only communicate what I had already experienced and to sort of synthesize that, and to be able to create in an environment where we developed an amazing thirst for education. We were highly driven in and outside of the classroom. We were really high achievers. Lewis transitioned out of this community school once his mother had left the party and recalls taking a standardized test for the very first time. I ended up going into the 5th grade when I should have been in the 3rd grade. I was about 15 at the start of my senior year of high school, and in many ways, I was far academically ahead of those students who were in my graduating class. The foundation for self-awareness and confidence they instilled in us kind of put us ahead of our peers in public schools. Lewis's experience was not an isolated one from students transitioning out of OCS due to graduation or other familial circumstances and into the public school system. A source of this self-awareness and confidence undoubtedly stemmed from the encouragement OCS educators gave students to ask questions and challenge ideas, even if those ideas came from instructors. The educational model, equally as important as the tentative care students received from teachers, remained aligned with one of the school's mottos: teach students how to think, not what to think. Instructors consistently uplifted students to research and investigate queries they had to come to their own conclusions rather than being punished for questioning taught material. When situations regarding discipline did arise, a youth committee of students themselves convened to discuss, empathize, and consider how to best handle the situation. The existence of the youth committee alone promoted a rightful sense of autonomy and leadership for children as capable decision makers, allowing them to learn that together they could lead justly. This restorative justice aligned disciplinary method proved drastically different from a disturbing lack of grace experienced by Black students outside of OCS who continue to be stigmatized and viewed as undeserving and in need of punishment, suspension, and policing, ultimately leading to their push out. Dr. Victor Rios examines this process of being pushed out as directly reframing of the concept of dropping out by emphasizing heightened surveillance and punitive measures of discipline pervasively enforced by a security apparatus, including but not limited to teachers, school administration, parents, community members, campus police, and parole officers. OCS dislodged the idea that discipline equates control, further rejecting notions of students' incapability of deserving trust to achieve justice on their own. Made evident by another one of the school's mottos, African proverb, each one teach one, instructors and staff normalize the idea that every individual embodies knowledge and it is their responsibility to teach someone else. Community inclusion was a priority at the school from its inception. Founding teachers at the school were not certified and were comprised of young parents and volunteers. From the hardworking cooks who made it possible for children to eat 3 full warm meals a day, to bus drivers who drove students on field trips and visits to imprisoned comrades. Staff and administration were viewed as meaningful and respected elders in their communities. As schools in the country continue to educate increasing numbers of racially minoritized students, a constant that remains is a majority white teacher workforce. A diverse and representative makeup of educators at OCS created an environment of belonging and support. Parents and volunteers offer their time, energy, and often resources in the form of donations of food and supplies for the children, which help successfully operate the school. A unique form of supportive relationships were established that affirmed the cultures and values of students and families. OCS students would write and perform plays for the community, highlighting their multicultural selves and topics such as African culture and Black history. As opposed to militarily reciting the National Pledge of Allegiance, every morning students began their day by meditating and tapping into their greatness. OCS Director Erica Huggins stressed this grounding process that she imagined an education that could prepare children for building another kind of society where students and communities could access this innate place of freedom inside us and peace. In the process of building a communally beneficial society, according to Huggins, it was important for children to sit and believe in peace. While the policing of Oakland and the rest of Black California in the 60s pursued order, it did not pursue a genuine peace. This kind of peace that Huggins was helping community members would enable them to pursue a different kind of society, not based on genocide, enslavement, and land theft and exploitation. OCS leaves behind a beautiful legacy going far beyond the students who attended the school. It is a legacy filled with inspiration from Black radical educators and the promise of educational learning spaces designed to nurture, engage, and accept students as they are. I believe that one of the lasting legacies of the school is that the entire OCS community cultivated lifelong learners who equally recognize the importance of collective responsibility as much as individual choice. Community affirming learning methods implemented at OCS typify historical exemplary response to a question posed by Black feminist writer and healer Adrienne Marie Brown. How would we organize and move our communities if we shifted to focus on what we long for and love rather than what we are negatively reacting to? Presenting the history of this educational institute in this academic space itself with my amazing colleagues, mentors, and now friends personally represents collective action as a response to Brown's question and in the spirit of everything OCS sowed. Thank you, and I will pass it on to Dr. Smith.
Thanks so much, Evelynn. Beautiful job. Okay. Black girls are expelled, suspended, referred to law enforcement, and arrested on school campuses at rates that vastly exceed the entire public school population and far exceed their white peers. This is a result of the adultification or the stigma of Black girls being seen as less innocent than their white peers and Black boys that are deemed more likely to be teachable and reformable. When adultification is applied to the individual and when stereotypes about adultification are institutionalized into school discipline practices and policies, Black girls face a disproportionate rate of punishments. Indeed, Black girls are subject to a related phenomenon in caricature of being assumed a supergirl, when strengths of Black girls are central and sadness is overlooked or dismissed, resulting in 1, negative teacher-student relationships, police bodies, and lastly, sexual objectification. According to a 2018 report from the National Black Women's Justice Institute, Black girls in kindergarten through 12th grade are 7 more times likely to be suspended from school and 4 times more likely to be arrested on school campuses. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights reported that while boys receive more than 2 out of 3 suspensions, Black girls are suspended at higher rates, 12%, than girls of any race or ethnicity and most boys. Moreover, in the South, where the highest rates of Black student suspensions occur, Black girls are suspended at a higher rate, 44.7%, than Black boys at 35.4%. In regards to the Black girls' educational experience, to utilize Monique W. Morris's conceptualization of their experiences, the punitive policies and practices fueled by systemic inequalities disproportionately push out Black girls. This means that Black girls have a stronger likelihood of becoming a part of the juvenile and or criminal justice system. This is a demonstration their schooling experiences are shaped by what anthropologist Damien Shadorner has called educational enclosures and forms of captivity that don't just mirror the prison industrial complex, but are their schoolhouse equivalents to it. Vastly subjectively marginalized, penalized and criminalized for their communication styles, attitudes, body language, facial expressions, hairstyles, inactivity, clothes, and trauma, Black girls experience educational journeys that are oppressive, dehumanizing, and place them in an everlasting state of psychosocial and cultural decay. Such as the case of 2 15-year-old Black girls from Malden, Massachusetts, Deanna and Maya Cook, who were suspended for a dress code violation for wearing box braids, or Vanessa Van Dyke in Florida for wearing her natural hair and not allowing her curious peers to touch her hair. In analyzing Deanna and Maya and Vanessa's case, as well as many others, Dorothy Hines and Jeremiah L. Young demonstrate that we are in the era of anti-Black girlhood, where racism, sexism, and other structural inequalities aid in the miseducation of Black girls and shapes the perception others have of them. This miseducation, which often comes through the stereotypes and media exposure to devaluing, demeaning, and disparaging notions and images of Black women and girlhood, haunts society's collective consciousness about Black girls. These responses and repertoires of behavior enable Black girls to demand protection, to claim belonging, or to insist that they are children and are indeed innocent. My analysis categorizes the range of forms of violence that Black girls and young women experience in the United States public education system into 3 levels: symbolic violence, institutional or systemic violence, and direct violence. The symbolic violence are internalizations of humiliations that reproduce the naturalizations of the status quo Black girls consistently experience, such as isolation, silencing, correction, policing, and restriction of developmental resources are linked to the adultification phenomenon, the expectation to practice the ideals of the culture of womanhood, and the maintenance of the politics of respectability. Institutional or systemic violence, or the consequence of social conditions, or the responsibility of a group or structure that leads to the constant demise or death of an individual, is more apparent than it is an issue of institutional and systemic violence. Specifically, Black girls and young women face institutional systemic violence through zero tolerance policies and practices of suspensions, expulsions, and other resegregatory practices rooted in gender inequality, racism, discriminatory laws, and religious ideologies. Direct violence has the effect, a potential effect of hurting the health and welfare of an individual. It can be physical, verbal, oral, or written, emotional, sexual, or racial, and can be directed against one individual or a group of individuals. This is exemplified by 6-year-old Talicia Johnson, who was arrested in Georgia in 2012 for throwing a tantrum in her classroom. The intersections of the level of violence specified against Black girls and young women have deemed them more susceptible to punitive, exclusionary, and resegregatory initiatives that serves as a deterrent in achieving future success and healthy lives. As recommended by scholars and collectives such as Ruth Nicole Brown and the African American Policy Forum, Black girls and young women need spaces and places that validate their narratives and provide them with liberatory and persistent strategies to pursue higher education. My research conducted on Black girls in Jackson, Mississippi, and Baltimore, Maryland, 2 cities with the highest resegregatory practices of Black girls, have Black girl dance education spaces that enabled me to explore the ways such spaces and places are created and sustained, and the kind of Black girl liberatory and persistent strategies and tactics that are cultivated. Jackson's Dancing Dolls in the Baltimore Young Women's Leadership School, Lead the Ladies, allows me to consider how Black girl collectives impact the symbolic, systemic, and direct violence Black girls and young women face at schools, and how such alternative, liberatory, and healing spaces of socialization impact Black girls' pathways to higher education opportunities. I explore the significance of the utilization of hip-hop feminist pedagogy by these Black girl programs, with particular attention to the emphasis on Black girls' community cultural wealth, literacies, community building, and critical mentoring through informal education. Finally, I consider how the Dancing Dolls and Lead the Ladies in challenging and appropriating the ideologies and practices associated with adultification. Specifically, this comparative case study will conduct a media content analysis on the Lead the Ladies documentary, Step, and the Dancing Dolls Lifetime docuseries, Bring It, to explore how these Black girl programs contribute to the higher education persistence of Black girls. Blogs, news articles, historical documents, and public school records of Baltimore, Jackson, and the Black girl collectives will also be examined to understand the educational conditions and the geopolitical climate of these communities. These methodologies allow me to explore the theoretical concepts of liberation, empowerment, resiliency, and persistence that are central to the identity politics of Black girls in their advancement to higher education. Furthermore, this comparative case study media content analysis extends work on Black girl-centered programs and resiliency by scholars such as Ruth Nicole Brown and Venus Evans Winters, by bridging the gap between Black girls' participation in these collectives to their resiliency to pursue higher education, and specifically into the ways that Black girls and young women can move from the school to prison pipeline to school to success pathways. Now, despite the hazardous effects of criminalization, adultification, and the Supergirl phenomenon, Black girls and young women have turned the adversity they face into various capitals and literacies that are central to their educational persistence in intellectual and identity politics. Where the United States education institutions barely provide Black girls the tools needed to survive, Black girl collectives provide the tools for Black girls and young women to survive and thrive inside and outside these institutions. Black girl collectives such as Dancing Dolls and Lead the Ladies are fugitive decolonial spaces and places that evoke hip-hop feminist pedagogy, uplift politics, a strong ethic of care to disrupt pervasive hegemonic ideologies of respectability, girlhood, and heteronormativity in the United States. The utilization of hip-hop feminist pedagogy provides a space to deconstruct and disrupt these dominant ideologies through the use of Black girls' bodies and dance as resistance and liberation. Black girl collectives as a decolonial space demonstrates a communal literacy or reading and learning to and for others through critical mentorship. Furthermore, Black girl collectives as a decolonial space expands the Black girls' capital and various literacies that are not promoted or produced by US educational institutions. The elements of liberation, empowerment, persistence, and resiliency are not only fundamental to the identity and academic development of Black girls and Black girl fugitive spaces, or Black girl collectives, but the production of the concept I'm developing, what is called magical capital. This extends Tara J. Yosso's community-cultural wealth model, or the non-traditional forms of cultural capital by marginalized groups, to identify the cultural knowledge, skills, abilities, and individuals that often go invalidated and unacknowledged. For Black girls, magical capital highlights the resilience, persistence, disruption, and appropriation of the cult of true womanhood and politics of respectability, while simultaneously capitalizing on a justification in the Supergirl phenomenon through Black girlhood celebration and swag that often goes unacknowledged, is trivialized and or criminalized inside and outside educational institutions. Furthermore, magical capital provides the understanding of how Black girls navigate and disrupt educational exclusionary practices and policies and still persist to higher education success, while envisioning a future of empowering possibilities rooted in love, a strong ethic of care, liberation, dopeness, and the reclamation of power. Thank you. I'll now turn it to Ms. Tara.
Thank you so much, Tiffani. My paper is entitled I Get Out, Pan-African Traditions of Educational Fugitivity. Discourses on the subject of fugitivity in the context of the educational enclosures that constitute how anthropologist Damian Sojourner describes the US public school system often focus on the formation of alternative schools as the best responses to the structural and symbolic violences produced by colonial and neoliberal schooling paradigms. Such alternative schools have been central to decolonizing projects in education and nation building. A foremost theorist of decolonization, education, and nation building, writer and literary theorist Ngugi wa Thiong'o claimed that most national liberation movements start by rejecting the culture of the colonizer, repudiating the religion of the oppressing nations and class, and the entire education system of the colonizer. Wa Thiong'o means by this that colonial and neo-colonial education, exploitative models of education effected to preserve a hegemonic social order, mystifies and obscures a people's true culture and history. This distorts a people's ontological and cosmological reality, causing the recipients of such an education to despise themselves, thereby accepting and even perpetuating their own subjugation. He includes educational systems in this list of institutions that must be transformed and uprooted because he contends that education should confer to its recipients knowledge of their own worlds and cultures by inculcating within humans a consciousness that enables people to recognize themselves as creators of their own self-images and their social worlds. For Wa Thiong'o, education is particularly important in conveying the culture of the organizer, the colonizer, because he claims that oppressive regimes cannot fully impose economic and political hegemony without enacting cultural control over those oppressed. Furthermore, Wa Thiong'o recognized education's inherent linkage to culture, either as a process whereby people integrate into the dominant culture, or rather, cultivate a type of consciousness that enables them to transform the dominant culture. I am most convinced that Wa Thiong'o's position is so, since such schools' existences are owed to the founders' heeding of an age-old mandate for those oppressed, expressed most resoundingly by film director Jordan Peele in the film Get Out. The title of this paper draws on American hip hop and reggae epistemologist and singer Lauryn Hill's eponymous song, I Get Out of All Your Boxes. Hill's lyrics refer to the racial settler colonial origins of the American education system as mind control, chains, a system for the dead, repressing me to death, and mass deception so that no one can live, psychological locks, animal conditioning, just to keep us as a slave. The chorus of Hill's song insists that knowing my condition is the reason I must change, echoing like Wathiango that the primary survival strategy is for us to let's get out, let's get out. Hill's haunting call in this recording includes obvious breaks, calls for divine assistance, insists that dying to the system is the way I have to live, and returns to a melodic, paradigmatic call and response, refusing to stay here hurting. While she talks to her audience during the recording, she insists that the American education system cannot be allowed to keep her listeners as slaves and in social bondage. This anthem is a protest song that declares an unwillingness to listen to or defend an educational system that kills freedom and prevents people from learning to walk and learn and grow. Hill provokes hearers with who made up these schools and that the only way to live is to die to such a system of engulfment and destruction. This admonition to depart from that which would infiltrate one's psyche and implant there within a false self, to liberate one's body from the docility and paralysis imposed by the imposter ideology that supplants the cultural knowledge that should form the core of the self, to avoid becoming possessed by another, is an echo from the past that informs us that the only way to save our souls from the soul-sucking system of indoctrination into inhumanity and competition is to depart from these institutions that corrupt, erode, and kill our innate capacities to love, learn, and grow, and to discern for ourselves. Get Out is a coherent cultural philosophical response to education that, if uncontemplated or unheeded, leaves one to their own demise. It is the signaling of an emergency requiring us to emerge from the dangerous situation to save ourselves. This command is echoed in multiple theologies and humanities. For early 19th century African diasporic thinkers, from Otoba Cuautle to Maria Stewart to David Walker, especially those who anticipated Pan-Africanism, Rastafarianism, and Ethiopianism, the biblical precept of extricating Africa's peoples from the "come out of her, my people, and be not partakers of her sin" mandate. Each of these early 19th century thinkers, some of whom lived across the Atlantic world, and some who were born free on the African continent, cherished liberation and deployed the prophetic Christian message of the book of Revelation, chapter 18, verse 4, like Hill and Wathiango, who in our contemporary times warned of the inevitable downfall of the system of mass confusion and false delusions. Likewise, this call to depart from the soul-stealing system is the prophetic wailings that proliferate through reggae epistemology, examples of which include musical artists such as Bob Marley's Exodus, Ziggy Marley's I Get Out, and Lauryn Hill's I Get Out of All Your Boxes. This epistemology, rooted in a tradition of rebellion and marronage, derides the notion of brainwash education, as Bob Marley sang in Crazy Ballheads, "Build your penitentiary, we build your schools, brainwash education to make us the fools." Even prior to the coinage of the term school to prison pipeline, reggae epistemology, as evidenced by these lyrics, articulated the linkages between the enclosures of prisons and schools as systems established to strip from Africans the knowledge of self and the personal and collective freedom that such knowledge confers. Therefore, to emancipate oneself from mental slavery is to heed the call to get out of the myriad enclosures of freedom, be they plantations, prisons, or public schools. And many have. Nevertheless, many more remain within these enclosures and struggle to survive with the fullness of their humanity intact. And so I ask, what becomes of the would-be maroon when, for whatever reason, they cannot get out? I wonder if the high rates of teacher attrition, described as a revolving door within the profession of teaching, can be read as fugitivity. I wonder if absenteeism amongst teachers and students constitute fugitivity as they attempt to steal their own time back from those that lay claim to the rights thereto. I wonder if teachers and students' self-medicating responses to hyper-stressful situations, structurally violent contexts, and days in and out of oftentimes meaningless activity are forms of fugitivity, ways of escaping an intolerable existence. I wonder if teachers and students' dissociative behaviors, they're taking flight via their imaginal worlds inspired by fugitive aspirations. And when students move the only thing they sometimes can, their pencils, eyes, hands, and attention to something or some imaginal place beyond, when souls take flight from that which demands of them their attention and their souls, can this be understood as fugitivity? Are these also attempts to get out? In my own research conducted over the past 4 years of teacher experience, teacher stress, and teachers' narratives about their expectations of the kinds of emancipation they hope to create in the classroom, I find that desire for fugitivity among them animates hopes for geographies far away from the classroom and their barracoon and plantation regimes. I theorize teachers' narratives using a congery of theoretical frameworks, including depth psychology, liberation psychology, theories of teaching as mothering, and teacher transgression as an ethic of care, all of which point to fugitivity on their own terms. Applying a depth psychological theoretical lens allows for a reading of teachers and students' fugitive responses to educational enclosures as symptoms seeking to make audible the voices of the unconscious that when tended to might provide a roadmap from departure from the ideological enclosures that often produce toxic affective classroom environments, which teachers and students must navigate. I also theorize teaching as mothering, to which I apply Tiffani Willoughby Herard's concept of care being and care work to understand how teachers sustain an ethic of care required to experience themselves as good enough teachers while ensuring their own well-being. Through Bell Hooks's theorization of teaching to transgress, I document how teachers steal time away from state curricular objectives and never-ending standardized test preparation, and forego curricular mandates that require a stationary existence by departing with students from their classrooms and by creating spaces within their classrooms where students can depart into their own imaginal worlds to draw enough energy to contend with the forces that seek to enclose their existence. Through teachers' narratives, I show how teachers resist the Cuautle of being frontline workers in what community psychologist Isak Perlotensky called an oppressed profession, in order to provide what educational theorist Paulo Freire called a conscientizing education. In conclusion, I have found that fugitive educators apply creativity and exopedagogies to mitigate the occupational hazards of burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma that kills their capacity to care. Their exopedagogical responses to educational enclosures prove that fugitivity, rooted in Pan-African abolitionist traditions, remains a vital survival strategy, essential to helping humans cull the confidence, which Juan Thiongo spoke of as being critical to the creation of a new heaven on earth, which he believed that only a decolonial education had the capacity to inspire. Thank you. And I will now turn to Mariel Rowland.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was beautiful. Wait a second. Y'all can see my screen, right? Okay. Thanks everyone for being here and listening to us. Today, I am reflecting on a 2021 Public Humanities Initiative that came out of UCI, and it asked students to reflect on the US Constitution's language of a more perfect union. In this paper, I will respond and share a different conception of unity through an analysis of pedagogies at work in the Activist Studio West education program. In 1996, Prop 209 successfully banned affirmative action in California after years of legal tinkering that increasingly lessened its capacity or appearance of a capacity to serve Black students. The decision to ban considerations of race, sex, or ethnicity in the hiring and admittance process allows for constitutionally constructed narratives of unity and all to pervade higher education. This further conceals the state's historical role in the simultaneous exclusion and exploitation of so-called protected groups. I consider the construction of unity in the Constitution, which is upheld through propositions such as 209, as part of a coded language. Unity on these terms is a signifier that conceals its own reliance on Black suffering and death. The paradox that I am calling coded language, Bell Hooks gets to the roots of in her 1994 book, Teaching to Transgress, in a chapter called A Revolution of Values, the Promise of Multicultural Change. She says, quote, "A culture of domination necessarily promotes addiction to lying and denial," unquote. Speaking to the conditions of an imagined post-racism society, Hooks' words reverberate as true still today as this imaginary permeates dominant discourse. Further, Hooks helps us to understand why a more perfect construction of this democracy could not untangle the deceit. To envision a world without Black suffering would not be to consider a more perfect construction of this democracy. If we understand what João Costa Vargas and Joy James put forth when they asked, quote, "What happens when instead of becoming enraged and shocked every time a Black person is killed in the United States, we recognize Black death as a predictable and constitutive aspect of this democracy," unquote. Vargas and James are asking us to think, not about what we imagine democracy to be, but what it is built from and on. What is its material and immaterial source? An understanding of Black death as the operational factor of this equation then requires an interrogation of the institutions that uphold it, making that of education a key site of study. My grounding is in educational research that helps envision anew structures that at their most base and foundational level do not rely on othering, exclusion, gratuitous violence, and Black femaleness as negation to function. In particular, I am interested in how radical pedagogy unsettles and departs from normative and prescriptive practices of control. In both Teaching to Transgress and Teaching for Critical Thinking, Bell Hooks lays out fundamental elements of a pedagogical practice that cannot be scripted and is never predetermined because it draws energy from flux, flow, and response. She names this praxis engaged pedagogy, one where teachers and students take part in the collective process of exchange. M. Jackie Alexander furthers this in her book, Pedagogies of Crossing, when she says, quote, "Pedagogies points to the reciprocal investments we must make to cross over into a metaphysics of interdependence," unquote. Where Hooks talks about the living, Alexander talks about the space between the living and the dead. She extends the pedagogies beyond our realm of touch, looking at what travels through time and space. Pedagogies that are from and work with the disembodied, attuned to what we cannot see or hear through the idea of a singular dominating episteme. So if not drawing from a singular dominating episteme, then what? What does a configuration of learning look like that departs from this and pulls energy elsewhere? Drawing on Martinican poet and theorist Edward Glissant's theory of a poetics of relation helps me to think through the multiplicity Hooks and Alexander offer us. He starts his discussion on the slave ship in the Atlantic Ocean. He imagines the horrors of this journey while attending to the exchange between enslaved people that never ceased. I take up his theory because of what it allows us to ask in sites where the violence of slavery dwells. to ask not only what is done in response, but how it is done and what connection and exchange even mean in what he calls a non-world. Glissant's poetics of relation honors opacity, allowing for the possibility of difference without total subsumption. This is based in connections for growth, not capture. I consider a type of relational unity in the work of radical Black women educators. I argue that the Black feminist pedagogies I will discuss today, pedagogies of and in process, come out of a particular relationship to students and the world based in a totally different vision of unity than that named in the Constitution. I conducted 4 interviews, one with each leader of the Activist Studio West program. This is a Black feminist digital archive and education program. This is funded through a historically Black colleges and University of California Pathways to Graduate School grant. This program was formed by professors Dr. Tiffani Willoughby-Herard, Dr. Jessica Millward, and Dr. Jessica Millward, who led alongside 2 graduate students, Ella Turen and LaShonda Carter. Collectively, they engage prospective graduate students from HBCUs around the digital archival process and support them through their own research projects. Today, I share only a brief section of my analysis from just 2 interviews I conducted with Tiffani Willoughby-Herard and Ella Turen. On September 20th, 2021, Tiffani Willoughby-Herard, professor of African American Studies at the University of Irvine, tells me about their pedagogy. They said, quote, "I think my approach is listening for and amplifying promise. I just see promise. I see promise all over the place. My understanding of the world is there's incredible promise and wisdom in everything and person I encounter. And so I think my approach is listening for and amplifying promise," unquote. We must stay with their uses of promise here and notice all that it contains in this context of their teaching. Willoughby-Herard says it is something that can not only be seen, but that they can hear. It is all around us, suggesting its limitless nature. It is not found in a talented few, but rather brimming in and around each of us. This amplification of promise is a pedagogical practice because it frames how they interact with students. Willoughby-Herard is engaging students from the understanding that they each carry something unique. It's not something given to them because they already have it. Her job is listening and looking for the ways it shows up and stands out. I read Willoughby-Herard's pedagogy as moving along Glissant's poetics of relation in that it is necessarily open to difference. Difference is non-threatening to their teaching model, as it is what actually makes way for them to conceptualize promise as abundant. Glissant describes this type of relation as, quote, latent, open, multilingual in intention, and directly in contact with everything possible, unquote. It follows, quote, uncertain paths, unquote. Promise cannot be predetermined or mapped. It must unfold on a path of its own design and teach towards this sort of development. And to teach towards this sort of development is to embrace its uncertainty. I read Willoughby-Herard's promise with that of Glissant's use of possibility because one makes way for the other. It's through a learning dynamic oriented around a poetic relation that promise and possibility can coincide. The late Ella Turen, who I just want to take just 2 seconds to remember. She was my friend and mentor and passed away recently. And yeah, I just want to take a second to remember her. The late Ella Turen, artist, activist, educator, and doctoral student in the Visual Studies Department at UC Irvine, echoes this dynamic in our discussion of her teaching practice. On October 20th, 2021, she tells me, quote, "You can't give somebody power. They already have power. You can't draw it out of them. You can create space for them. You can draw it out of them. You can create space for them to discover it and to really hone into it," unquote. This being the kind of space that led her to her own genius, a space that was created over time and spun out of the people who saw her power. Turen describes the process of her teaching as a type of giving that grows and comes back to her. For Turen, this giving is replenishing, and much like Willoughby-Herard's conception of promise, it is abundant. She does not see students as lacking, and therefore her role is not to fill their void. She makes a sharp point here to clarify what she does not intend to do through teaching and mentorship when she says, it is not about empowering them. To empower someone is to assume something is lacking. They both speak about a learning environment that operates on a different plane of unity. It does not demand oneness, sameness, or even agreement because it is seeking, grounded in, made possible by exchange. Both educators disrupt a pedagogy that seeks to control and determine by introducing pedagogies that seek to open up and let unfold. The possibilities that emerge from these pedagogies will undoubtedly be very different. It is in the space for and attention to power that Turenne speaks to, and the knowing of promise Willoughby Herard sees and hears that becomes the source for their teaching. The pedagogies explored here oppose control in the classroom, seek to bring students closer to who they already are, and act through networks of mentorship that allow for learning that is layered, never singular, and constantly unfolding. In doing so, they conceive of and make room for relations that can exist between time and space. Thank you all so much for your time today and your patience with us. And just to close, we would like to invite you to another iteration of this panel on May 20th, if you would like to take a screenshot. We would love to see you there. It's free, it's virtual, and it's through the UCI Humanities Center. And then on behalf of NCOPES, if you have the means to donate, please do so. And update your accounts before the conference is over. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists. And, this was absolutely amazing to re-envision schooling as an institution and to re-envision it in a way so that it's, no longer weaponized and, no longer rooted in anti-Blackness and white supremacist violence. So each of these women gave examples of their own research and, the ways that they advocate, pursuing alternative liberatory ideals and fugitive methods for education through past and present Black feminist abolitionists and other radical methods. So we have about 20 more minutes. Does anyone have any questions? I'd like to entertain questions from the audience. You can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand. Okay, Sekou Franklin.
How y'all doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Although I'm not on the screen, I'm definitely paying attention. My question is more so, see if I can say this the right way. In my early years, in the early to mid 90s, to listening about that, I'm getting old. I worked freedom schools for 5 summers, 4 in the Bay Area and then 1 in DC. But I was going to ask this question for this idea of educational fugitive. I said that as a background to explain my empathy and my my alignment with the research. But how do you protect against maybe a co-optation of educational fugitive activism by right-wing forces, for example, who may be pushing charter schools, corporate-backed charter schools that are really kind of modern variations, at least we're seeing this in the South, modern variations of kind of white Christian academies, but kind of using the strategies or the language that to really kind of push for these kind of corporate-backed charter schools. How do you guard against that, or how do you guard against even efforts by, I know, some prominent Black, celebrities that are pushing for their own charter schools? And how do you advance educational fugitive activism, but at the same time guard against maybe a co-optation of folks who really want to maybe co-opt the language or co-opt the strategies to really advance kind of corporate-backed charter schools or corporate-backed voucher programs?
So I'm going to open that question up to the panelists.
If I can, I'm just jumping in so I say things before I forget them. But I think that that's a really important question, and there's like probably a bunch of different ways to answer it, but to like, I guess, selfishly point to something that I mentioned in my own paper. I think one, certain knowledge, traditions, and practices can sort of serve as a lens. So a frame that I use is transformative justice, and it explicitly refers to practices that happen outside of the state. And so that's just one sort of knowledge tradition that's linked with others, and sort of the, I guess, the scholar that I cited there in that speech that she was giving, she explicitly mentioned that, for example, transformative justice, which refers sort of broadly to a way of living that serves as alternatives to punishment, that's not something that, like restorative justice, can be implemented in schools. It fundamentally happens outside of state institutions. And so I think that situating sort of the creation of fugitive educational spaces or practices or relationships, combining practice and process with like that sort of theoretical lens as like a compass, can help distinguish what is co-optation and what is transformation, with the latter having to exist outside of or beyond state institutions like charter schools. And so I'm not sure if that answers the question about whether it would be co-opted. I think at some point, inevitably, discourse gets co-opted by the state, but people that are doing the work can use those sort of frameworks as compasses to distinguish between the two.
Yeah, piggybacking off of Margaret's excellent answer, you know, I also use my own research to answer the question, because there's just nothing that we can do about about charter schools and other means or other entities that try to combat these practices. And so with Black Girl collectives, they're really significant, and especially in terms of Mississippi, which has the worst educational rate in the United States. And these desegregatory practices have been enacted just throughout its own entire history. And also with the geopolitical lens and where in proximity of Baltimore Leadership School for Young Women next to Washington, DC, where a lot of these educational policies are like being enacted or not enacted, is very key and poignant, because these collectives really combat what Jasmine is talking about in her own research is really dope. Fugitivity is an anti-racist paradigm through which people and their everyday practices escape the capitalist impulse to confine, detain, and commodify their existence as both capital and labor. That's what these Black Girl collectives do, and also the appropriation of such. I mean, the policing of their bodies, the commodification of their bodies, the silencing of their voices is not within these collectives. And so even some of the schools that the girls attend in Mississippi as well, they do go through these things, but the ability to be part of these Black Girl collectives, which is really emerging right now, there's many more than the Dancing Dolls and the Lethal Ladies, is really, really evident to the ways in which that can be combated, because these charter schools and other entities are kind of just here to stay, unfortunately. So the emergence of these really is important. And so while Jeremiah L. Young and Dorothy Hines says that we're in a state of anti-Black girlhood, I believe that Black Girl Collective serves as a reclamation of that power to combat those. So that's very important.
And I would add that appropriation of the language of social justice happens all the time. I mean, the idea of reverse racism or reverse discrimination, or the Blue Lives Matter response to Black Lives Matter, I think we see this kind of co-optation of pretty much every effort that we make to deviate from the system of racism. And so it is not surprising, although I would not agree that what they're doing constitutes fugitivity. For us, in their minds, somehow it does, and it is what it is.
So please, any more questions from the audience?
I'd like to piggyback off of what the soon-to-be Dr. Jones, I believe, just said, and to say that one ways of really thinking about fugitivity here is to really rethink what is the relationship between the three structures of political concepts, right? What is the state? What is government? And what is democracy? And I think one of the things here that is hard for us is that all of the expressions that you all gave are great, amazing, beautiful, small d democratic models for what fugitivity really could mean. And I want to think back to Angela Davis as well, right? The person who trained Ruth Wilson, like that pushed Ruth Wilson Gilmore to put this into geographical terms, and also who pushed Damien in a lot of ways to rethink this in the site of education. And I wonder if our focus so much on the state as the dominating function, which it is, by definition, the state is the monopoly over the use of violence in a given territory. So I'm not going to deny that as a basic definition of state. But governance is related to the state, but it's doing something differently. So how could we, as abolitionist thinkers, create institutions that fit without and under a structure of accountability, right? How do you see these examples fitting in a larger structure of accountability, I guess is my question, as these alternative models? Because I don't think an abolitionist practice is entirely an anarchic one. Does that make sense to people? This is not anarchism. This is not an anti-state anarchism. It is something more than that. It's something deeper than that. So could anyone want to talk about that kind of connection and why abolitionism is not anarchism here? Thank you.
Can I jump in and say something? I love that question, and I think that, and I've seen the example of an independent school that does not receive money from the state. It does not receive grant funding, no funding except the tuition and anyone's donations that they choose to accept, because they also have refused to accept donations. That to me is sort of anarchist, but it only lasts through like 12th grade because we don't have universities. So then the students are they have to get the vaccinations to go to college or get the religious exemption, and then they have to go into those institutions. And some students survive and do extremely well because they're so much more prepared. They're so far advanced. But others are just like, it's too oppressive. So I think that it is possible, but only until you have to go into a state institution, a public institution, or a private institution that, is funded by the state and federal government. So I don't know if does that make sense? Yeah. But you all can jump in as well. I mean, Mariel, I don't know how the free school that you're talking about fits into that, but I would think that Evelynn's example of the OCS fits into that. But then again, we saw the adult student who said that he did do well when he was integrated into the school system and was excelled. And it sort of reminded me of the independent school that I'm familiar with. But I don't know if you all want to jump in anymore.
I would like to add, Learning from what director Erica Huggins, who was the director of OCS for a majority of its time of operation, she specifically mentioned in a panel, the distinction of abolition and anarchy and their relation to funds and just keeping it open. And it wasn't anarchy at all. And they went so far as to they won awards from the state legislature, and it was and she mentioned too, like, emphasized how they weren't going to close themselves off from the support, but they were also weary of receiving grants that they were eligible for, but had to change their curriculum to sort of backtrack on their own ideals. So I like that question, and it's something I also want to further consider as I'm remaining in the project, is how it differs from a complete saying F you to the system, but how to live and make space for ourselves within it that we don't surviving ethically, right?
Yeah, piggybacking off of that, I mean, the Baltimore Leadership School for Young Women is a public charter school for middle school and high school Black girls, where at least 99.9% are Black girls. And so the idea of this collectivity, which Dr. Maya Rocky Moore Cummings was talking about, the idea of collectivity is very central in these locations, even though they're at a school which guarantees them some type of college access 100%, they still felt the need to develop this collective, or this Black girl collective, or idea of Black girl fugitivity with the lethal ladies, meaning that there's something that is missing inherently within the charter school, which I think is kind of anarchist in a way. So it's kind of like working with and against the system in terms of appropriation of that. I don't think it has to be so anarchist. I mean, that's a really great point. But I think in the means of what Dr. Cummings was talking about yesterday, you kind of can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You have to work against and with the system in a sense.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think it's also not as clear cut to me. I think of abolition as operating on so many levels, and as well as fugitivity. And I think as we're trying to change systems and the practices that support the systems, we're also trying to change the ideas that they're operating off of. And so that's why for me, Hooks has been so integral, because she's while advocating for what I would think of our abolitionist ideas, there's just a complete reconceptualization of what knowledge even is. So for her, knowledge and love are intertwined, and that's completely going to change how a teaching and learning operate, if they're moving along the same path, if they're not these separate entities as they normally are in schooling. And so, yeah, I think while that may not be anarchy, it is still, it's kind of this seeding into something that will inherently disrupt. And so, yeah, it's powerful.
And I think rather than thinking in terms of anarchy, the idea of marronage, I think, is really, in my view, a more appropriate way to think about how we understand fugitivity as being in constant flight, and not just departure in a physical sense or in a totalizing sense, but in terms of adapting pedagogical practices of resistance and survival on the metaphoric plantation, as we strive also to move into our own spaces.
But isn't maroonage, in a way, those communities that didn't create alliances with the slave societies when they were found, isn't the Maroons who fought back and, you know, kept running further up into the hills, isn't that sort of anarchist? The ones who made alliances to return people if they came to the communities might be working within the structure, but the ones who didn't make the alliances and kept fighting and kept running, wouldn't they be sort of anarchists working outside of the system, or no? What do you all think? And I would ask Dr. Yarish, you know, I'm enjoying this conversation.
I think I would add one of these things is I'm asking this question because this is what all abolitionist thinkers get, right? I'm not asking the question because I think that the anarchist position is worthless or worthwhile. I think it's just a question that we face. And we live in a time where abolitionism as a philosophical project is becoming the more and more mainstreamed, right? In a way. And I want us to be careful. But I also want to say that there are different traditions of anarchism that can be held here. So when I think about bell hooks, I think about Emma Goldman. So there weren't alliances with the states that were oppressive, but there were other alliances with other nations, right? Maroon communities became part of indigenous communities that became part of white flight refugee communities, like Free State. We always remember thinking through the Free State of Jones. And I say that because Françoise knows that story from both of our mentor. We talked about this for a long time. What does it mean to create an alternative? An alternative does not necessarily mean in absence of, it means in place of. How do we make a place? And I think that there are portions of the anarchist tradition that are there that are helpful, but there are other ones that are not. And I know Margaret, I jumped in, so please go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I was going to say something before, but then I'm thinking more about what you were saying. And I think before I had just, I wanted to bring up the notion of like contradictions, and that like that's like I think like an inevitable part of transformation, and you can look at the contradiction. I think a lot of it is like experimentation too, and trial and error, and you can look at the contradictions that arise when we try to experiment with these different definitions of anarchy or alternative forms of governance, and use those contradictions as like part of the conditions of possibility for transformation. And that, I guess, it's a balance, and there's not a clear-cut answer. And there's like within, I wanted to say before, I was thinking about someone's comment about integration into like state structures or conventional institutions when people leave, I guess, fugitive or autonomous spaces, and how like in the school that I'm teaching at and looking at, I think that they conceptualize, for example, things like even a high school degree as a mechanism of survival and like a navigation strategy that, you know, if we don't help students, you know, get these, I guess, achieve these particular markers of success, then that will hurt them or kill them or whatever it is. But that you can sort of like strip the ideological power from those metrics of success and say that that's not what defines your worth. And when you come here in this space, that doesn't matter. But when you leave, you need this thing. And I think like Mariel was saying, there's like the structure and ideology are like separate but related, and that change, I guess, non-material change that happens within these spaces, the way that we learn to relate to one another or define or definitions of human and worth and care, people move within and outside of spaces, and they can carry those things with them. And it doesn't mean that the thing outside the space doesn't exist. But yeah, so that's sort of my half answer to it.
And certainly also, right, some of these independent schools create their own diplomas, but to validate the students' knowledge, students used to, I don't think they still do, have to take the GED to prove that they met certain educational requirements. And also the SAT and ACT, even though they're no longer really required by many universities, including Ivy Leagues, because they're not really an indicator of student college success anymore. It's your junior year of college. But they would take those exams to prove, as you said, Margaret, that they measure up academically, and often they would excel. So, but yes. So do we have enough time for one more question, or no, we're at an hour and 30 minutes. So I will let folks go so that they can get to the next panels. And I would just like to say thank you very much for attending this and for participating. I'm sure the panelists here will stay on if anyone has questions, but whoever would like to leave is free to go.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments and your inspiration and your support. I, as well as all my wonderful collective, appreciate it.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much. And don't forget the Humanities Center in a couple of months in May. It's also virtual. So Margaret, I'm going to set this up. I want you to just put on your title page so I can get a picture of you. Let me stop the recording. There we go.
So